PowerPoint slides for today. Can you just, I mean, I know it's the second link that works. The first link is the wrong one. Yeah. So please just download the one on the second link. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at what's on Edmodo. I didn't manage to get a lot of stuff in today because I was working on the slides, and you will realize that I have some new articles that just came out about Ukraine and Russia. I mean, about U.S. and Joe Biden talking about Russia possibly attacking Ukraine, right? But you will notice that most of the articles that I have here is mostly on U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. Yeah, so I haven't actually had the time to go through um, the last couple of hours to look at possible new media articles, but I think you guys can probably go through and get some yourself. Um, okay, anyway, let's take a look at what I have up here. So, Joe Biden, he's actually saying that he thinks that Russia will attack Ukraine, but he is also warning that Russia will basically the same thing, face stiff price for attacking Ukraine. Um, yeah, so he at first said that it was a minor incursion, which basically ruffled feathers in Ukraine. But later on, the White House issued a hasty clarification, um, saying that any movement of Russian forces over the border would be treated as invasion, not just a minor incursion. Yeah. Uh, okay, but as you know, right? This Biden was, I mean, not Biden, Blinken was actually in talks as well with his Russian counterpart. Um, Not too sure what came out of that. Um, yeah, but basically, both sides are not really coming together, right? Because of Russia's demands to freeze the number of member states in NATO, right? So anyway, Blinken tried to basically extend sort of an olive branch to the Russians, to his Russian counterpart, saying that they want peace, right? They don't want any conflict. That the U.S. doesn't want any conflict. I did also. Okay, so there's actually some people who thought that the fact that the U.S. and Russia was holding talks actually signals that diplomacy isn't dead. Yeah. But of course, Germany has actually said that it could halt its gas pipeline. It's just a leverage, right, to basically um, dissuade Russia from invading Ukraine. Yeah. So basically, yeah, Blinken managed to probably talk to Germany, and basically the German chancellor basically said that he's open to possibly sanctions on Russian, if Russia were ever to attack Ukraine, and that would also include Nord Stream 2. Yeah. But of course, Russia has always denied that it has any plans to attack Ukraine. Okay, so I've actually put up. I also uploaded this article on from the Financial Times. Yeah, this one actually talks about Macron actually possibly coming together to, I mean, putting together a European deal, right? EU deal with Russia. Let me see. Was it? Um, yeah. So basically, Macron is calling on the EU to forge its own plan for security and stability with Russia in a move that risks undermining Western solidarity in the face of Kremlin aggression towards Ukraine. So basically, Macron is calling for EU states to conduct their own dialogue with Russia rather than support diplomatic efforts led by the US and NATO. Remember that Macron just took over as the president, right? So um, he's also, basically using this event to basically seal French leadership, right, of the EU. So his intervention, basically, some people are saying that his intervention is the first example of public dissent between NATO members since US basically warned of the potential Russian attack. Yeah, so basically Europe is actually trying to de-escalate the tensions with Moscow. So this is like a break to the united front between the EU and US on Russia. Okay, so that's I uploaded it as a PDF file because Financial Times, sometimes when you get back to it, it doesn't actually allow you to um, view the whole article. That's why I PDF'd it as soon as I could, as soon as I saw that it was a full article, so that I could upload it. Okay. The U.S. lawmakers are actually calling for UN to review release its Uyghur rights report before the Winter Olympics. Yeah, so they've been finalizing a report on the situation in Xinjiang and hoping to publish it in the coming weeks. Um, of course, this is going to probably question China's human rights record in Xinjiang, which China has, of course, denied any wrongdoing. They say that basically the camps that they have are for vocational training and to stem um, religious extremism, and it's not mass detention camps as some of the Western countries have labeled it. Okay, and then I think it was yesterday, or was it? Actually, this would probably be on Monday, I think. Xi Jinping actually delivered an address online, right, to the WEF, the World Economic Forum's Davos Agenda Conference. So basically, he's saying that, I mean, he didn't name US, but he's actually basically asking, saying that criticizing the acts of containment, suppression, and confrontation, right? And he said that it's just going to do more harm to world peace and security, and has catastrophic consequences. Yeah. Um, yeah, so he's basically saying that you know uh, we shouldn't use a zero-sum approach, right? Which of course he was referring to the US when he said that, right? Um, let's see, what else did he say in his address? This is actually the third time he's spoken that Xi Jinping has spoken at Davos, and of course he's still defending globalization, right? And he's also warning against, you know, warning against an increasingly polarized world, which of course is basically the world is polarized because they are actually driven by fears of China's dominance in world trade. Okay, I thought this was an interesting article in Reuters, right? Where basically, apparently Taiwan has paid for a lobbying contract to promote Guatemala with US officials. Guatemala is one of the last few, I think there's only 14 states now that still continue to recognize Taiwan. Um, and Guatemala has actually been sort of in the US bad books. Yeah, so what Taiwan has done is actually um, to pay a firm called Ballard Partners um, to lobby the U.S. To lobby U.S. Politicians and U.S. Interest groups, right, to put Guatemala in good light. Because Guatemala is under pressure for because U.S. has actually basically raised its concerns about its ability to battle corruption. So it's been heavily criticized by the U.S. and they also um, yeah. So Guatemala and the U.S. the relationship isn't that good. So Taiwan is basically paying right a PR firm to help lobby help Guatemala lobby for goodwill in the U.S. Okay, so ASEAN, they have actually postponed their foreign ministerial meetings, I believe, because there hasn't been much done on the side of Myanmar, right, in terms of any progress. So um, basically, Malaysia and Singapore have opposed the idea of inviting back the junta to the ASEAN meeting. Right? So there's basically disagreement within ASEAN about how whether to exclude or include Myanmar. So in the end, they've called off um, the foreign ministerial meeting. They've basically postponed it. Okay, so those are the okay. So those are the media reports that I have for you today. I didn't actually manage to go dig out anymore because I was just trying to get the slides together. Did any of you see anything else that should be included? I think. Oh, there's also. I forgot. There's also Russia and Iran. Yeah. So Russia and Iran apparently, of course, finding some common ground, right? Because of that situation with the U.S. Yeah. Okay, so they've been putting on a show of unity. Basically, Putin um, held a meeting with Raisi, his counterpart, right? Um, and basically, Iran is telling uh, Raisi is telling Putin that Iran has been under sanctions for 40 years, right? And it's basically managed to still resist the U.S. Yeah. But of course, you saw right that last week the Iranian foreign minister was in China, and they are basically further hammering out right that 25-year agreement that China and Iran had signed. So. Uh, Yeah, so Iran is also trying to pursue a long-term agreement with Russia. I mean, their agreement with, I think they are actually pursuing a 20-year agreement, right, to look at technology transfers to Iran from Russia and the purchase of Russian military equipment and Russian investments in Iranian energy infrastructure. Okay, so that's those are some of the articles that I have. Uh, Russia releasing ammonia near Ukraine. So we're not sure whether that's a real um, a real thing that happened or it's a fake news, right? Okay, let's take a look at what we're supposed to cover today. We're actually moving on to block 9. And I had a bit of a problem trying to put it together because that I mean it's slightly diffuse. It doesn't really all come together as a um what do you call it? I mean it doesn't really come together as um a cohesive topic. Yeah. So I mean if you look at the learning outcomes actually looks at basically the significance of transnational actors in shaping a state's foreign policy. So basically, how transnational actors might play a hand in shaping a state's foreign policy, and also looking at intergovernmental organizations and non-state actors and the process by which they actually influence a state's foreign policy, and then assessing whether complex interdependency provides a useful model for understanding how transnational actors are engaged with the state and foreign policy. Yeah. So I basically am. I mean, for this lecture, I'm actually looking at all these things that are related to these learning outcomes. But there are also other things that also come into play, which would be the humanitarian intervention, the foreign policy with regard to humanitarian intervention, and all that, which comes under the purview of especially the UNSC UN. Right? Um, that I think I'm going to cover next week instead. So I mean, I had a little bit of a problem trying to figure out, what would be the coverage, the topics to cover for today. Yeah, so you'll notice that I mean for today I have actually mostly right concentrated on what non-state actors are, and then also giving you a little bit of a framework, right, by different theorists on how non-state actors, which encompasses also the intergovernmental organizations, um, interact with states, yeah, and what sort of relationship they have with the states. Yeah. Okay, so you will notice that I've actually used a number of readings for this lecture, mostly Christopher Hill, right, which you have as an essential text. Um, I believe it's chapter 9, I think, of Chris Hill. Yeah. And then there's also um, I was looking at Alden, but I didn't actually use it in this particular lecture. But I looked at Alden in terms of his the subject guide, yeah, which I've also uploaded into essential text for you guys in Edmodo, right? So if you look at the essential text, under the Edmodo folders, right, you'll be able to find the subject guide there, right? Just read the one on transnational actors and foreign policy. It's actually very short. It's only about maybe 4 pages long at the very most. Yeah, it's a um, very short overview, right, of transnational actors. And basically he also based it mostly on Chris Hill, right? So if you really want to, I mean, get the more fleshed out version, you should actually read Christopher Hill. And then there was one of the assigned readings is Rogerson, which basically is where we'll be talking about the complex interdependency, which is a concept that uh, Kyohane and Nye actually came up with in the 1990s, which Rogerson basically further fleshes out in his article. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at non-state actors. So if you look at, how non-state actors are being defined, you'll see that they are actually um, defined as political actors, which are neither states nor representative of state-created bodies or intergovernmental organizations. So these are basically non-state actors, and there are actually conflicting views on what role they play. Right, some say that they are basically a vanguard of the emerging civil society, and they are there as non-state actors to challenge the power and authority of the authoritarian states, right, as well as international capital. So this is basically the idealist view of the of what non of the role that non-state actors play. And then you have the realist view, which looks at non-state actors as front organizations. Basically organizations that front certain movements, right? Which may be they may be actually the handmaiden or agents of particular states, or it could be potential revolutionaries that are seeking to undermine the state. So it could be front organizations of hostile states seeking to undermine a particular state, or it could be potential revolutionaries within the state that's seeking to undermine the state. So this is basically the realist view. So basically, Jocelyn and Wallace says that any interpretation of international relations and global politics must now take the significance of non-state actors operating transnationally into account. So basically, you can't think of non-state actors as just domestically um, rooted, right? As just basically operating in a domestic environment, domestic national, political environment. But you need to take into account that these non-state actors now have networks across the world, and they operate transnationally. So they basically go across state boundaries. Okay, so these are the types of non-state actors, which is basically listed in, I believe it's Hill. Yeah. So now basically he looks at it as international governmental organizations, right? Non-governmental organizations, transnational corporations, and others. Yeah. So if you think about international governmental organizations, you see that basically these organizations are made up of member states, right? The members are all states, right? Externally recognized legitimate states. Yeah, so if you think of IGOs, right, you would look at UN as an example of an IGO, United Nations, NATO, Arab League, right, Organization of American States, etc. Yeah. Even I guess you could also consider ASEAN as well. Yeah. Non-governmental organizations will be composed of individuals and groups. So some examples of NGOs would be Amnesty International, Red Cross, MSF, etc. Yeah. Then you have transnational or multinational corporations or enterprises, right? Sometimes they call it TNCs, sometimes they call it TNEs, right? These are actually companies that span national borders, territorial borders. And so if you think about large transnational conglomerates, you think of things like ExxonMobil, Starbucks, Walmart, Apple, etc. Yeah. And then there are others which don't fit into these categories of IGOs, NGOs, or TNCs. These would be individuals, cities, constituencies, or even diasporas, right? The diasporic communities. And so if you think about individuals, right, you could think of George Clooney, for example, as being one. He was very, he was well known for uh, his activism, I guess you could call it activism, on Darfur, right? And then you have New York City that does, cities also have, they also cross boundaries in the sense that they have twinning with other cities, right? They may have programs that where they actually collaborate, cooperate with other cities around the world. So that's how they could be non-state actors as well, right? Al Qaeda, right, being a non-state, political actor. Then you have Indian diaspora as well, right? The Indian diaspora is actually the largest diaspora now across the world. They do actually have wield quite a bit of influence, power. Yeah. Okay. So that's, oh, sorry, I forgot to change. Yeah. So that's where you see that there are different types of non-state actors, um, which he'll actually uh, list down in his chapter. Yeah. Okay, so then if you go on to look at what how Hill distinguishes between them, right? According to Hill, right, transnational actors may be distinguished according to their focus. So they could be, you can actually distinguish them according to whether they are focused on territory. So there may be TNAs or groups that seek or use a territorial base, right? And they are usually antagonistic towards the host state. So these would be, for example, right, Kurds and Palestinians, which are communities within a whole state, right? And they are, I mean, if you they are seeking to basically break away from the state or have to establish their own state. Yeah? And then, like just now we said, right, there's the others, right? So the cities, constituencies, and all that, right? So these would be the territorial ones. So the cities, regions, or units inside a federation could also produce foreign policies. So, for example, like I said just now, twinning programs, right, with another subunit in another state. So you could have cities within the U.S. that has twinning programs across the world with other cities right around the world, right, where they actually collaborate, cooperate on certain things, on certain um, programs, environmental or otherwise, or investments as well. You know, then you have ideological or cultural focus, where basically these sorts of groups, right, would try to spread their ideas and their values across national borders. And often this is based on single issue causes. So you may have environmentalist groups, you may have human rights groups, right? So you could have Amnesty International, Greenpeace, um, that are trying to basically spread their values, their ideas across national borders. So Greenpeace actually trying to get other all different states around the world to be more green in their in their policies. Yeah. You may also have epistemological communities, right? Those communities that have certain specialized knowledge, and they want to basically spread those ideas and knowledge, right, across national borders. So these would be like the climate change scientists, right? Climate change scientists that come up with a lot of research, material research papers, right, um, on the impact of climate change, right? So they are trying to basically lobby all the different countries around the world, right, to raise their awareness about climate change. You could, I mean, with the pandemic as well. Now you find that medical doctors, virologists, right? They also have specialized knowledge, right, about how viruses spread, what we can do with, how can we contain those viruses, right? Especially with COVID-19. Yeah, so you find that these epistemological communities also, do have to play a part, right? And they also transcend borders. Yeah. Then you have religious groups, for example, the Catholic Church, right? That may also be involved in trying to spread, their religious messages, their values across national borders, right? Even missionaries, right? Missions, all these religious missions and all that. These are also ideological cultural groups that um, aim to spread their ideas and values across national borders. And then you have humanitarian organizations like Red Cross, MSF, right? That would, the Red Cross is basically um, the organization that upholds international humanitarian law, and international humanitarian law, and then human rights law as well. Yeah, so these would be, the Red Cross would actually be spreading those values and ideas across national borders. Yeah. And then you have economic focus, those TNAs that are economically focused. These would be the groups that are focused on creating wealth, like TNCs or TNEs. So they would basically be trying to exert pressure on governments to liberalize trade, provide tax incentives, tax havens, etc. Yeah, and also to basically deregulate, right, the national industries, grant more licenses for the exploitation of minerals, allowing for looser immigration policies, so it's easier for these TNEs and TNCs to operate across borders as well. So these are how Hill actually distinguishes between the different types of transnational actors, right? In terms of their purpose, the focus. Okay, I think this what do you call it? Table isn't very clear, but probably you can um, basically figure out what it says. It is found in Hill, page 216. I think I will, when I upload the final draft, I will try and get a better copy of it because I had to. Um, yeah, let me see if this is better. Because I had to basically get it reduce the file size. Is this better? Okay, so this basically looks at TNA versus state relationships, right, in international politics. Yeah, so what you see is that basically Hill says that there are basically three types of relationships that you largely can see between TNAs and states, right? There could be a what we see as a normal bargaining relationship. Um, so he outlines what TNAs may do, what states may do, and what the nature of interaction between TNAs and states. Whether it's a cooperative sorts of relationship, or it's a competitive relationship, or it's a uh, 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 uneasy relationship. Yeah. So in a normal bargaining relationship, he sees it as more the interaction between TNAs and states as being more of a compromise, right? More cooperative. Yeah. And they are actually the state would of course try to, would be pretty open to engaging with the TNAs, right? They may even, they will try to get them into a dialogue. They may even try to co-opt them, right, and try to influence the TNA um, for in order to fulfill the state's own purpose. Yeah? So you find that this is basically characterized by things like foreign aid ventures, right, where the state is basically looking at TNAs for foreign aid, right? They may actually compromise on certain things, right, in order to get the foreign aid, right? So there's actually in this sort of relationship, this normal bargaining relationship, it's more or less a rather balanced relationship between the TNA and the state. Yeah. When you see a comparative power relationship, that's when you find that the TNAs actually are um, a little bit more of taking more of an antagonistic role, right, towards the state. It is actually trying to stir up public opinion, trying to um, cause divisions in the state, right, and it is also trying to create transnational coalitions. Yeah. The states actually, what the states may do is they may ignore these TNAs, right? Or they may use its powers to basically tighten the screws on these TNAs. So they could use legislation, they could use tax, they could use border regulations to try to weaken the TNAs. You know? So there's mutual hostility between the two, and what you find is that this is usually uh, seen in um, situations where the state and the TNAs actually clash over human rights issues. Yeah, or maybe it could be through about um, technology transfer. It could also be the TNA could also be a diasporic community that is that wants to change the home the government in the home country. You know? So the advantage, right, as to whether the state is more, no, whether it lies in the state or with the TNAs, it actually varies. But ultimately, according to Hill, the advantage is usually on the side of the state. When there's parallel relationship, right? So that would mean that the TNA would actually focus on their specific business concerns, right? So usually these are, like TNEs, right? Epistemological communities, right? They would actually tend to disregard the national frontiers. They don't see the state as a main interlocutor with it. So the states may not be able to find may find that it's actually difficult to ignore these TNAs because they do have an impact on the state, on its economy, right? And so the states may try to control them, but it may not be always successful. So there's actually a rather mutually suspicious sort of relationship between the state and the TNAs, partly because the states do not know how to react to the TNA, right? And so there is some sort of, they do have diverging priorities as well. Yeah. So in such a case, in a parallel relationship, the advantage actually lies with the TNAs. Yeah. Okay, so there is also the question of why, what do TNAs do, right? How does it actually, you know, uh, influence foreign policy, right? How do we see TNAs being a active participant in the foreign policy decision making process or the foreign policy making process? So you find that non-state actors, right, tend to uh, actually influence foreign policy as entrepreneurs. So Fenimore and Sicking actually says that they introduce new ideas and they basically try to link those ideas to um, existing norms, right? And try to basically, because they hope that by having those ideas linked to existing norms, right, the state actors would actually be more willing to adopt these new ideas and new norms that is trying to um, put on the agenda. Yeah. So basically, what TNAs are trying to do is trying to introduce new norms that states will adopt, and that's how they actually seek to influence foreign policy or decision making. So basically, when you look at how a norm is actually introduced and what happens during the life cycle of norm, basically the stages, it follows basically these stages. Basically at stage one, that's when the TNA, right, would basically introduce a new norm, right. There's actually a conviction that a certain norm must be changed or adapted or must be created, right, to address some sort of shortfall that the TNA has recognized or identified. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that just because a TNA, right, a transnational actor actually introduces a new norm, that it will automatically be adopted by the states, right? It would need to require that it would only the new norm will only be adopted or will actually reach a tipping point only when there's enough states that are willing to adopt the new norm. So at stage two, that's when states actually adopt the norms, right? Because there's been pressure, international pressure to do so, right? Or it could be, it would help. No, the fact that states actually would adopt those norms maybe because they feel that it would enhance their domestic legitimacy, right? And they need to, there's international pressure to conform, right, and they may actually have esteem needs that would help them to raise their profile and their status if they were to go along with those new norms. So then after the norm cascades, then you have norm internalization, where the state actors then internalize the norms. Over time the norms become codified, and then there is universal adherence to those norms. So basically what this is one of the influential ways that TNAs uh, could have exert an impact, right, on foreign policy or on the state's foreign policy. Yeah. Okay, so when will this tipping point typically be reached? All right. So basically, when you look at when you examine all the different norms that actually came into being and became entrenched, right? You find that there are certain factors that need to be there, right, in order for the tipping point to be reached. So legitimacy. So if states are more likely to, you find that states are more likely to adopt norms when their domestic legitimacy is wavering. So that affects the timing of when a norm will actually gain traction with the states. Yeah. So if states, if the what do you call it, the political leaders, right, their domestic legitimacy is wavering, right, by adopting new norms, right, they may actually help to shore up its domestic legitimacy. Mm. Also, prominent or powerful states do play an influential role. So if powerful states actually uh, agree or set the motion in set the norms adoption in motion, right? Then um, those norms are likely to be adopted. And usually, powerful states would also define those norms, because they would only support norms that would basically be congruent with their own values and ideas. Then you have intrinsic qualities of a norm. right, which may make it more appealing. So certain norms, right, for example, norms about violence against vulnerable peoples, or equity of opportunity, right, would tend to be seen as appealing, right? It would be also a little bit more universal as well, right? So that would be those norms that would basically gain traction, um, would gain converts, right? Converts among states. Yeah. Then you have adjacency. So if a norm is actually a new norm that's being introduced is actually similar to an existing one, or was derived from it, or extends an existing norm, right? The likelihood of that norm being actually adopted by states is much higher. Mm. Then, of course, it also, again, it depends on the world situation at the point that the norm was introduced. If let's say we are coming out of a depression or a shock, right, that may actually cause states to want to look for new norms, right, to stabilize the international order, etc. So they are more open, right, to adopting new norms. Post-war also, states be um, may be forced to adopt the victor's norms. Okay, so it doesn't mean that when new norms are introduced, right, that it will be um, you know very easily embraced by all the states, because there would be conflicts between the international and the domestic norms. Yeah? So when you look at transnational actors, what they usually do is they are actually trying to define international norms. Yeah, and if let's say you were to adopt those international norms, and as a state, you need to uh, you need to ensure that it doesn't conflict with your domestic norms. Yeah, so to a certain extent, you find that international norms, right, sometimes may be also um, uh, variously interpreted, right, by the states themselves based on you know uh, their cultural um, situations as well, their cultural values as well, because you find that actually local beliefs, right, local belief systems do actually influence, right, the degree to which they actually employ uh, those norms, to the degree to which they actually implement those norms. And they may, I mean, certain local actors in Southeast Asia, for example, Amita Acharya noted that local actors in Southeast Asia tend to employ strategies such as resistance, adaptation, and adoption, or replacement, right? When faced with international norms, that are being imposed on the local scene, right? Then, of course, you also notice that locally there may be local norm entrepreneurs as well, who might be catalyzing actors that may help to extend those international norms to the local um, scene, right? And especially when international norms are mostly set by Western polities, right? Western states, right? The local norm entrepreneurs will need to interpret it for the local adoption, right? And they are central to actually extending those international norms to non-Western polities. And then you find that international trends may also discredit, right, some norms while allowing other norms to take root. Yeah. So that's how new norms may actually be adopted, may also be resisted, may also be replaced. Yeah. Okay, so um, let's take a closer look at what are IGOs, right? So basically, if we look at international organizations, right? Um, Basically, you'll find that they are intergovernmental organizations, are actually state-created bodies, right? That the prime purpose of it is actually to mitigate conflict between states, to try to um, you know, dampen down conflict between states in their when they interact internationally, right? So it helps to put a measure of stability in the anarchic international system. So the objective, right, of IGOs would be to facilitate commerce and communication, provide for peace and security through collective action, and to distribute governing capabilities among member states. Now, these are not universal objectives across all IGOs. Some IGOs may actually have reflects one or two of these objectives more than the other. So IGOs mostly are viewed by realists as instruments of the states. So what do IGOs do, and how do they actually impact foreign policy? So basically, if you look at IGOs, what they do is they actually constrain the state's ability to influence the international agenda. Yeah, so IGOs consist of also institutional rules and procedures, right, which were put in place when the IGOs were set up. Yeah. So these institutional rules and procedures actually act as a barrier, right, to states' ability to basically take unilateral action. You know? Because if you're a member state of an IGO, you are actually bound by the rules and procedures of the IGOs. So IGOs usually require member states to consult and establish consensus, right, prior to policy formulation. So if you think of IGO, for example, like the EU, right, you'll see that member states, right, need to actually be involved in the consultation. They need to actually establish consensus with all members, right, before on the policy that they are actually um, uh, discussing, right, before they actually are able to firm up the policy and then implement the policy. So foreign policy making becomes pretty enmeshed in coalition building strategies within the IGOs. So you find that because member states, of course, right, want to um, formulate policies that protect their own uh, um, national interests, right? As a result, they will basically build coalitions, right, with allies, with more like-minded states that have similar national interests and national concerns, right? And as a result of this coalition building within IGOs, you find that the policies that actually are produced are actually are actually they tend towards producing suboptimal policies. Yeah. But IGOs actually provide a system of global governance, um, and that actually helps in basically stabilizing what would be an anarchic international system, bring some international order because of the rules and regulations that they impose, and hence, right, you'll find that instead of a very chaotic um, international system, you actually have a more mature anarchy. Okay, this is actually a video, right, outlining some of the challenges that um, you know, uh, participants in IGOs face. Yeah.
The OPCW is currently the only organization in the world that has a mandate to work on the disarmament and destruction of a class of WMDs. And this is something I wanted to see myself, how it works. How does it work? What does it take for a country to disarm? What are the legal questions? What are the legal obstacles? At the end of the day, we have states with whom we have to deal. They are our main shareholders. They are the ones giving us our mandate. And if we don't understand that we're dealing with sovereign states, it's very difficult to work here. It's very difficult to work. And I think the few lawyers that I've worked with coming from the private sector who have worked for international organizations have found that to be the most difficult thing to digest. Diplomacy, policy can slow down things drastically. And in the private sector, you want to move. You have a plan, you have a project, you want to move because time is money. But very often we find here that policy consideration, diplomatic considerations will very much dictate how things will be done. And if you don't understand as a lawyer, then if you don't have that patience, if you don't have that respect, then you have no future in the governmental organization.
Okay, so this actually explains why things move pretty slowly, right? Pretty slowly when discussions are made within IGO, within the context of IGOs. You know. Okay, complex interdependence. We had mentioned that complex interdependence, right, is actually a concept, right, that Kyohane and Nye had actually come up with, basically to discuss the changes in the global environment due to information age. So basically, there's the two authors basically are saying that with an increasingly information reliant, information interdependent world, right, it has actually changed the way international relationships actually have developed. Yeah. So basically, they're saying that international relationships have actually gone beyond the assumptions of realism. So Rosencrantz was one of those that said that when you talk about interdependence, I think we talked about this last week as well, right? When we talk about interdependence, we're actually talking about connectedness between groups. And Rosencrantz also said that it's a state of affairs where what one actor does actually impinges directly on other nations. So you'll find that as you have greater interaction, right, um, with other actors, with other states, right, there will be greater uh, greater effect, right, in terms of the interactions would actually have other consequences, right, on other actors that you come into contact with. So the outcome of interactions are actually not very you can't really say that the outcomes are given, right? Because the interactions between actors, right, would necessarily lead to other responses and reactions. So it's not a direct outcome that you can easily predict. You know? So if you look at economics, you find that comparative advantage actually creates interdependence between states, right? Because comparative advantage in production means that if one state is more, no, it's more better able to produce a good at lower cost, right? Then you should actually be that state should be specializing in it and trading it with another state that has a specialization in a different uh, product or a different good that it wants. Yeah, so that actually creates interdependence between states. And of course, with interdependence, you find that interdependence also generates reciprocity, right? But if you look at reciprocity, there are both advantages as well as disadvantages from reciprocity, right? Because the advantages would be that there could be a benefit or a gain that you could reap because of this interdependence. You can get your goods at a lower price. You don't have to put in as much resources to produce a good, right? And it could also mean that it may lead to cooperation in other areas, not just in economics, but also other areas like security as well, or technology, right? It could also lead to the formation of community. So you find that when states actually start to interact a little bit more, they may start to think about forming a community of states, right? That's Deutsch. And then, of course, you find that it would also encourage voluntary political and economic cooperation between states as well. Once they become, um, they have greater interaction between them, right? They are more. They build a relationship of trust, right? They build credibility with their trading partners. That would then encourage further political and economic cooperation, which would be more voluntary. Yeah? But the disadvantage of reciprocity and interdependence is that it does actually lead to a notion of dependence, and as a result, also your sovereignty may decrease. Right, the sovereignty of your state, right? Your ability to exercise independent action would also be decreased in exchange for being in exchange for your interaction with the state or being part of a community of states. Okay, I do have three videos here looking at the EU, right? Right after Trump decided to pull out the JPCOA, yeah, with Iran. Yeah, so right after Trump decided to pull out the Iran nuclear deal, right, he imposed sanctions on Iran. Yeah, so this actually created a little bit of issue with his EU allies, because they actually did not agree with the US pulling out of the JCPOA, and also they had already built up quite a bit of trading relationships with Iran. So the EU was looking for ways to actually combat US sanctions or to basically go around it. Yeah. So the next three videos are actually looking at the EU and how it tried to bypass and why it tried to bypass, why it decided to bypass to help Iran, right, avoid the US sanctions. Okay. Do you all want to watch these three videos now, or do you all want to take a break first and then we can come back and watch the three videos after the break? Because I think it's pretty long. Let's see, it's at least 15 minutes, I think. All three, for three. Okay, actually about 12 minutes for all three. Okay, then we can watch first.
For over 70 years, the Western alliance has been strong. The US and its European partners have forged economic, military and cultural policies in their mutual interest. Until Trump. In just a year, the American president ripped up many long-standing agreements and treated his European allies and NATO, the linchpin of Western security, with disdain. In August 2017, the US gave notice of its intention to withdraw from the Paris climate deal, which nearly 200 countries have signed, leaving America the only nation on Earth not involved. And then in the space of 6 months, he moved the US embassy to Jerusalem and abandoned the Iran nuclear deal, moves that all of Europe begged him to reconsider. That last one may be a step too far for the deal's EU signatories France, the UK and Germany. They're now trying to find a way to preserve the deal and maintain their important economic ties with Iran. But it's not going to be easy for them to chart an independent course from the US. The US uses powerful economic sanctions against its rivals, banning supplies from Chinese technical companies in its recent trade war and punishing the Russian aluminium industry for their interference in the US election. Now the US is threatening to prevent European firms from using the US financial system and administer other punishments if they violate new sanctions on Iran. It's a tough situation. Most international trade depends on the US dollar. America's financial system provides safe transactions and liquidity. Being cut off from this global system would be a major blow to the EU. There's a lot at stake. The EU and Iran established strong trading ties in 2016 and increased the volume of trade after sanctions on Iran were lifted. France's Total, an oil company, for example, made one of the biggest deals with Iran, signing a $2 billion agreement to develop the country's southern gas field. And Iran ordered 100 planes from the French company Airbus. And the EU's exports to Iran were around 100 times larger than US exports to the country in 2017. Iran's fuel and other energy exports soared by 344% in 2016. Car makers, oil, natural gas and aircraft are the strongest industries linked with Iran. Now all that potential business is in jeopardy. But the EU has resisted US sanctions before. When the US imposed sanctions on Cuba in 1996, the EU introduced what they called a blocking regulation to keep trading with the island nation. It banned EU companies from complying with US sanctions. They managed to create a series of political regulations as well as development and economic ties. And now the EU is Cuba's main export market, and the EU is the largest foreign investor in Cuba. Now European leaders are considering that same blocking strategy to protect their vital and growing economic deals with Iran. They're also trying to develop a euro-based financial system to direct flow of money to Iran. But in order to do that, they'll have to pick a fight with the country that has been their strongest ally for decades.
Looking at the latest decisions of President Trump, someone could even think, with friends like that, who needs enemies?
Okay, so this next video actually looks at how EU is how EU actually bypassed the US sanctions.
Several EU states have created a new payment channel in a bid to bypass US sanctions on Iran. It's called INSTEX, and Germany, France and the UK are behind it. It's designed to allow Iran access to European markets without having to rely on international banks, because banks face penalties under the US sanction regime. The new payment system will allow Iran to sell products like oil, for example, to European customers. INSTEX would then get and keep the payment for it. In turn, European companies can deliver food or medical supplies to Iran while getting paid by INSTEX. That would allow participants on both sides of the system to avoid running afoul of US sanctions that only forbid monetary transactions with Iran, which INSTEX circumvents. Still, companies using INSTEX might risk retaliation from the US. Well, INSTEX will be a topic at the EU foreign ministers meeting in the Romanian capital of Bucharest today. And our Europe correspondent Barbara Wesel is there and standing by for us. Barbara, is this really about business and trade, or is INSTEX a political instrument?
It is a political message, of course, because we remember that the Europeans were quite angry when Donald Trump, the US president, sort of started blackmailing them and threatening European banks. If they would get involved in trade with Iran, they would be severely sanctioned. We also know that many banks have absolutely pulled back and were afraid of burning their fingers. And they said, this can't go on. We can't be just pushed around, because the Europeans, the three countries, France, Germany and the UK, who have been partners in the Iran nuclear deal, they still say that Iran is keeping its side of the treaty, it's keeping its side of the deal. There may be concerns about other problems, about human rights, about the missile systems, but this deal is still alive in the eye of the Europeans, and so they are now trying to do something to take a stand and to circumvent US sanctions and to sort of show that they can't be just dealt with like that from the US.
Barbara, the White House presumably doesn't like this the one bit. Do the three European powers behind this expect any US reactions?
They do expect some reactions, of course, because all the people who are involved in this, and particularly the German director and probably people at the seat in Paris and maybe even the British CEO of this undertaking, they are going to be issued with diplomatic passports. In course, in order to make it impossible for them to sort of be stopped internationally by some extradition demands from Washington. So, yes, they do expect something. Do they expect from Washington to sort of the trade, to step up the trade war? Nobody knows yet. But they really felt that they needed to take a position in this because they feel that if they sort of concentrate on humanitarian deliveries at the moment, it is something that could not and should not be faulted by the US.
Barbara Basil there in Bucharest for us. Thank you.
Okay, this is a PBS analysis of why the US is helping Iran avoid US sanctions. It's, I think, based on also an interview. Yeah.
The U.S. and its European allies work together on many issues, but under President Trump, they diverged dramatically over Iran's nuclear program. When his administration had the U.S. withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal last year and then snap back sanctions on Iran, the Europeans objected strongly. Today, they took a major step to try and help Iran get around those sanctions. Here's Nick Schifrin.
When the U.S., Iran, and the Europeans signed the 2014 nuclear deal, Iran froze its nuclear program in exchange for billions of dollars of economic benefits. The Trump administration's withdrawal from the deal meant Iran never received much of the revenue it was promised, which is why the Europeans today announced a company financed by Germany, France, and the UK that's designed to allow Iran to both gain some of that revenue and keep them in the nuclear deal. The new company is a kind of clearinghouse that allows Iran to trade goods with foreign companies without any money exchanged. That means they avoid U.S. banks and U.S. dollars so they could avoid U.S. sanctions. The Europeans say the first goods that Iran will receive include drugs and medical devices, which Iran needs. To talk about this, I'm joined by David O'Sullivan, the European Union ambassador to the U.S. Ambassador, thank you very much. Welcome back to NewsHour.
Thank you.
Are you trying to undermine U.S. efforts on Iran?
Absolutely not. I think the most important thing to underline is that we in the European Union believe that keeping Iran in this nuclear deal, and they are complying with this deal as was announced just this week by the CIA. And in return for that, they are entitled to expect some economic benefit and some increased trade and economic activity. And the purpose of the announcement today is to allow this to happen. And as you say, the primary focus in the beginning will be on goods which are not actually under sanction at all, which are humanitarian goods, exceptions to your sanctions regime, but which it's sometimes difficult to trade because of the reluctance of financial bodies to deal with anything to do with Iran. So this will make that, we hope, easier.
Why risk exacerbating a disagreement with the U.S.?
Well, we respect the decision's administration to withdraw from the agreement, but we imagine they also respect the fact that we are still signatories to the agreement and we feel bound by it. And it is also profoundly in Europe's security interest to prevent Iran from developing or obtaining nuclear weapons. But of course, we also share many of the concerns of the administration on other Iranian activities, and indeed just recently announced some additional sanctions in response to some of the terrorist plots which were uncovered in Europe. So we're trying to work with the administration even as we have some disagreements about this precise deal.
As you say, the point of this is to try and keep Iran in the deal. Do you think it's enough? Obviously, many companies that deal with Iran have already said that they won't try and use this vehicle because they fear U.S. secondary sanctions.
Well, at the end of the day, companies will have to decide whether they feel comfortable trading with Iran, and we know that some companies may take the decision not to for fear of the secondary sanctions. But we on the European side are determined to make every effort we can to continue to allow Iran to have the commercial benefit from this deal, which was promised.
But if the focus is on drugs, then how do you get Iran that economic benefit that you say it needs in order to stay in the deal?
Well, I think the focus is on delivering stuff which is already permitted under humanitarian exceptions. But of course, in other ways, we are also continuing to look at ways in which we can improve economic conditions with Iran. There are small and medium-sized European companies who don't necessarily trade heavily with the United States or at all, who may be interested in doing business. Of course, it's challenging. There's no point in pretending it isn't. But we still believe it is very much in our national security interest to preserve this deal and to deliver some of the benefits which Iran is entitled to expect.
Let me read a statement from the State Department, or a State Department spokesperson today. Quote, entities that continue to engage in sanctionable activity involving Iran risk severe consequences that could include losing access to the U.S. financial system and the ability to do business with the United States or U.S. companies. Do you fear the U.S. could actually sanction the U.K., Germany, or France?
I think the U.S. and the European Union are very strong strategic partners. We respect fully the decision of this administration to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. We believe they should also respect the fact that the European nations have decided to remain party to this which is sanctioned by UN resolutions.
Do you think any of the U.S. pressure on this effort is misplaced?
Well, we don't share the administration's analysis, but we understand that they take a different view, and we are friends and allies, but sometimes we take a different view, and that is the case in this instance.
It's 2 months to Brexit Day. Is the EU willing to renegotiate the deal, as British Prime Minister Theresa May's opponents in Parliament has pushed her to do?
I think the answer has been very clear. We believe that the deal as signed or as agreed is the best deal. The so-called backstop, the provision designed to prevent the re-emergence of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, is a fail-safe mechanism. It's an insurance mechanism. It's not the end point we expect to reach. We hope we can achieve the objective of no border. I don't think anyone sees scope for renegotiating that at this point. But of course, I think people will listen to what Mrs. May has to say. And if there is something in there that can be done to be helpful, such as the declaration on the future relations, I think people will try to be as helpful as possible. But it took us 18 months to negotiate this deal. And in fact, the final version of the backstop, which is contained in the deal, was actually very much designed by the UK itself, not something which was imposed by the European Union.
Another option, would the European Union be willing to extend the deadline if the British Prime Minister asks for that?
This is legally possible. It requires the unanimous agreement of the other 27. But I'm sure if there were to be such a request, people would listen very carefully to the reasons for such an extension. And I'm sure people would try to be helpful. But I think they will need to understand what it would be hoped could be achieved during such a delay.
David O'Sullivan, EU Ambassador to the U.S., thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. What did you get out of the 3 videos with regard to interdependence or complex interdependence? Did you see any evidence of interdependence between the different states or EU and Iran, for example? Or the US imposing sanctions and its, what do you call it? It's the effects on the EU. Yeah, so EU is trying to preserve um, the trading relationship with Iran, right? But it's also circumventing it by basically focusing more on humanitarian, right, issues. Um, yeah, it's probably has actually been good for them because it actually positions them quite positively, right? Um, but you notice that when the U.S., I mean Trump, decides to um, impose a sanction, right? It does have a trickle-on effect, yeah. So because all of them are in this deal with Iran, right? So there's that interdependence between the states, right, with regard to how they're connected on this issue of Iran. Yeah. And of course it does, right, this, basically, like Rosicron says, right, state of affairs where what one actor does impinges directly on other states. Yeah, so that's actually you see that they, I mean, in terms of the US especially sanctioning Iran, right, and then because they're all in this deal with Iran, right, expecting the EU to also do the same, right? In that sense, you find that, I mean, if the EU were to basically follow, I mean, you could say that they are basically constrained by the partnership or whatever the deal, but at the same time, you could also say that the EU, right, is not actually, I mean, the EU countries itself themselves, their sovereignty is decreased by having to follow the lead of the US, right? Or being constrained by the deal itself. Yeah. So there's actually this notion of uh, you know countries being parties to an agreement or to an international organization, having to basically sacrifice some part of their sovereignty as a result. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, we are at 1:30. Do you want to take a break here? And then we can come back, say about 1:50, 1:55. Would that be good?